Everybody, welcome to another video. Today is 11th of May. Today we're looking at the recent escalation of fighting on the Russian-Ukrainian border in Kharkiv Oblast. We're going to look at where the hotspots of the fighting really are located. We're going to look at the publicly available information, of which there's a lot of ambiguity surrounding. We're going to look at the breakdown of Russian and Ukrainian forces in this region and just look at some of the general topography, geography of this area because I have not really covered it in detail, mainly due to time constraints. You can see I added in this polygon, which I will expand to show the Ukrainian controlled side of Kharkiv Oblast. And of course, if the situation does really escalate over here, then I'll add in the Russian polygon indicating their control over Belgorod Oblast and going into Ukrainian controlled territory. And as you can see, based on Google Maps, you could see where the white line is. That's supposed to be the demarcation line between the Russians and Ukrainians, and now you can see where the gray zone is forming in the areas between the white lines and Ukraine's blue lines, and so that should give an idea of where the battles are currently taking place. In terms of the two main axes, you have one that is in the direction of Liptsi over here. I'll show, of course, with arrows to give you guys a visual understanding of this. So you have this Russian push that is occurring through this particular axis over here, but is also extended further west to the village of Hoptivka. And then further eastwards, you do have another accumulation of Russian forces pushing in the areas surrounding Vovchansk, which we'll talk about a lot as the video goes on. And so just to start off with what the Ukrainians were claiming, the first information they received of a Russian activation over here was around 5 a.m. on May 10th, when the Ukrainian MOD claimed that there was an attempt by the Russian side to break through their defensive lines in this region. They claimed that they were able to repulse these Russian attacks, but they were certainly not over, and they would continue for the entirety of the day. And again, they did claim that the Russians conducted some heavy strikes on the Ukrainians, especially with fab bombs around the Volchansk area, as we zoom in and see that. And the Russian forces are bolstering their reserves in this general sector. And some of these claims were echoed by the head of Kharkiv Oblast, but there also is conflicting information because, on the one hand, the Ukrainian MOD did claim that they were trying to break through the Ukrainian lines, and the way they were characterizing it in the post implied that there were significant amounts of vehicles being utilized. And then in the claims made by the head of Kharkiv Oblast, they said that it was more so a Russian reconnaissance grouping that was conducting these sort of assaults, and they were of course utilizing artillery cover during the night. But he echoed the claim that the Ukrainians had not lost a single meter of territory throughout the night, and that the Russian grouping itself was only sufficient to cause what he referred to as provocations on the Ukrainian border, which I guess is the equivalent of saying that they could raid the Ukrainian border but not get any sort of solid foundation across it. And as the day went on, you had Ukrainian sources claiming that there were battles going on in Borisivka. And by the way, the fact that there was even a battle going on in a certain piece of territory does imply that the Ukrainian forces were pushed out from a certain area and the Russian forces did advance at least to a certain amount into the Ukrainian territory, which means that they did actually lose a certain amount of land. And so what the Ukrainian sources were claiming is fighting around Borisivka, Pilna, especially Krasne, Strilecha, and then further westwards around Hoptivka. And so those were the villages mentioned. There are a few others that you see on the map that were mentioned by Russian sources, which I'll get to as well. And then some Ukrainian sources, they claim that they were able to target these Russian infantry that were mainly not utilizing wheeled and tracked vehicles, but that they did receive aviation support, along with, of course, active Russian air defense systems and reconnaissance drones that were just very active throughout that entire time period. But they said, these are Ukrainian sources, that using their artillery and mortars, they were able to target Russian troop clusters using FPVs. And now looking at some of what the Russian sources were saying during the same time period, there was more quiet, and that is again perhaps due to some sort of operational secrecy. But throughout the day, as we reached noon, and especially now, we are seeing a lot of information coming out from Rybar. So in the noon update by Rybar, they did claim that the Russian forces were able to penetrate around 2 to 3 kilometers on this Liptsi axis. I guess that's how we'll refer to it from now on. and you could see that being reflected in my mapping of the situation. And that they generally said that there were two axes where the Russian forces were pushing and were really expanding the gray zone. And then by the actual evening update for Rybar, they were already showing the Russians in control of a significant number of villages. And so I've not shown that on my map because there's no visual evidence of this, but I have adjusted all those areas where Rybar claims that there were villages taken to at least be indicated as gray zones, because we do have the ambiguity surrounding the status of those villages. And so they claimed that Hoptivka was taken by the Russian side, while Kordivka was still in the gray zone. They claimed that Strilecha was taken by the Russians, along with Krasne, Pilna, Borisivka, Zelena over here. And then going further eastwards to the Volchansk area, they claim the Russian forces got control over Orhitseve, Hatishe, and then also of Pletenivka. And this would be a sizable amount of villages for a Russian DRG force, which is what a lot of sources are reporting. That is a certain element of the Russian army that was responsible for these assaults. That it was these sort of reconnaissance scouts that conduct more so raids in smaller numbers onto Ukrainian territory, and they've been present on the border for a very long time, conducting such operations not just in Kharkiv but also further north in Sumy. And now it is, of course, the case that they're increasing their ferocity and are actually trying to conduct assaults that are more permanent in nature, that are able to actually cross over the border for a prolonged period of time with an extended amount of firepower. And so just one example of that is around Pilna, where Deep State, they actually did reports that over the past few days, there have been Russian DRGs active in this village, and they released these drone footages, these pictures that back that up, showing Russian forces operating in the center. And so now we know for sure that the Russian forces are operating there, and that lends credence to the idea that the Russian forces today were able to utilize that forward base to advance along this particular paved road further south in the direction of villages such as Morochovets or Olinkove. And this is interesting because Deep State earlier on May 10th, they claimed that there was a Russian advance along this paved road that was then repelled by the Ukrainians. And they had this geolocation which turned out to be wrong, which is located at this particular area. And despite the fact that the geolocation that was marked by the deep state mapping was incorrect, we did see that there were fires reported in the same area. And so it is possible that you did have some sort of Russian advance in the area and Ukrainian shelling in the region, which is now reflected in the satellite imagery. And in regards to the one photo that we really do have of ground engagements during these Russian assaults, it is a pile of 5 Russian vehicles that was either abandoned or destroyed on the Russian side of the border, right at the entrance to Pilna. And so the Ukrainian side, they're claiming responsibility for destroying those vehicles, saying that it was due to the work of FPV drone crews from the PK Blinders UAV units. And so they are active, of course, on this front. And even as per deep states, the actual gray zone looks pretty similar to what I'm mapping over here. And you can see it on the map actually that this is a sizable chunk of land in the sense that it is just filled with open fields and various villages. And it's, I think when I measured it more accurately, it was like 40 square kilometers in size. And then there's like 6 square kilometers in the area around here north of Volchansk. And so it is a pretty large amount of area, a large amount of fields that have been abandoned by the Ukrainians, and now the Russians are occupying themselves. And in terms of the wider significance of this, I'll really divide it up into several options, and you guys come to your own conclusions about this, because we're going to look in really a lot of detail at the potential troop structures, but based on the current utilization of DRGs, the current amount of units that we see deployed in this region, that does not really seem like enough to launch a full-fledged defensive operation in the direction of a major urban center like Kharkiv itself, or really any other major cities that are located further south over here for a sustained period of time, which of course requires a large rear force. It requires a massive amount of support from artillery, and of course you need to get an ancillary tank and vehicle component, which we've not seen yet fully fleshed out during these Russian assaults. And I know it's really the first day that we've seen it discussed heavily, But for now, we need to be careful before coming to such conclusions. But looking at what the Russians are doing, regardless of their plans for actually launching an offensive over here, what it does do is create this effect on the Ukrainian population, on the Ukrainian public, where a lot of them would see it as extremely dangerous for the Russian forces to be able to reassert control in an area that had previously been really taken over by the Ukrainians again, where they had reestablished the pre war boundaries. And so there was a lot of internal pressure, a lot of political pressure on the Ukrainian command to not allow the Russian forces to stay in this area. Just first of all, because of the PR view, but also because of worries that then it could be used as a base to expand further south and attack various Ukrainian villages that had been taken over in previous Ukrainian counterattacks from 2022. And this means there will be an onus on the Ukrainian command to move, whether it be critical munitions that are coming in from the west, artillery guns, additional infantry, which is probably the biggest point that I want to stick on. Move all of these critical components that are needed for fighting a long term defensive war that are needed on various parts of the front line. Just looking at four key parts, we have Robotyne, we have Chasiv Yar, Kupiansk, which is a bit further to the east. Looking at Avdiivka, of course, and various other nearby sectors. All of them need reserves right now. They definitely do need reserves. If we look at the attrition of some of the units that are fighting on the front line that have not been able to get proper rest and rotation for half a year or more in some extreme cases like the 47th Brigade. And now those infantry men that are extremely fatigued over that period of time, they are going to receive even less support than they have already been receiving, because some of those munitions that are coming in from the west that have reached them in the past 2 weeks will be diverted to defend against any sort of Russian presence in this region. And so, as a whole, it has a major effect on really the entire line of contact, and it does slightly weaken it in every single particular point. And even then, it still could not be enough to potentially push back the Russian forces in these areas if we look at the imbalance between the amount of Russian forces that are stationed in the Belgorod region versus the current amount of Ukrainian forces that are located in the Kharkiv theater. Now, if we want to look more deeply into possibilities for what the Russians are trying to achieve from a territorial framework, then again, I really don't like making speculations of the sort. But when people have asked me previously about my thoughts on the Kharkiv border, going back to as early as last year, or over a year and a half ago in 2023, I would always say that the area that, for the Russians at least, would be the most advantageous to push along this entire border, if we're looking all the way from Belarus to where we currently have the Oskil River front, the most beneficial and realistic area for the Russians is this strip of land. I think it's like, if we measure now, it's like 75 kilometers wide. This strip of land that starts from the Oskil River and goes all the way to the Donets River. And this is an area that includes Volchansk if you look further north. And that's an area where right now the Russians are actively probing and assaulting, pushing towards the outskirts of that city. It's a city that is a massive logistical hub for the Ukrainians. A lot of roads in this region intersect over here and then branch out into various parts of the border with Russia. And so it is extremely important for the Ukrainians for their coordination on the line of contact over here. And now you already have the Russian forces pushing in this area, putting pressure not just on the ground but also from the air. Massive amount of FAB strikes, artillery strikes on Ukrainian deployment points in that area. And in terms of the elevation, it's hard to visualize because we haven't talked about it a lot, but there is just this entire chain of towns that are located along these two parallel lines, and they are all just located on extremely low elevation due to the river that passes through that area. And then you have these pretty highly elevated interfluves that are under Russian control, located to the northwest and northeast of Volchansk. That, I guess you could say, started in Belgorod, and then you have another one that sort of branches out like this. I'm just generally marking this off of my memory. But these are just two major ridges under Russian control that are overlooking the Ukrainian positions in Volchansk and nearby border villages, and just leaves them extremely exposed, especially when you think of the Russian artillery that is stationed on these hills. Now, in terms of elevation, this entire strip of land that I was referring to, in general, it is on a relatively high elevation besides the Volchansk area. And that's also part of why it's so beneficial for the Ukrainians, because that gives them the proper cover they need to protect their forces that are located further eastwards in the Liman tactical grouping. And it would be extremely dangerous for the Ukrainian forces if they were to lose control. And now we're talking extremely long term, because we're talking about really a massive piece of land. We're talking about dozens, at the very least, of kilometers of advances southwards. But just for the sake of imagining this, all of this red rectangle over here, for the most part, is located on rather high elevation that overlooks the Oskil River. And that is something that the Ukrainians cannot afford to lose to the Russian side, because then the Russian forces would, first of all, be able to flank the very large Ukrainian grouping, which is in the thousands, if not tens of thousands, that is across the Oskil River and then also further south, not just cutting them off physically and getting to the river crossings, but also to flank Kupiansk from the east, which would be a major danger for the Ukrainian connectivity in the region, but also just overlooking it by getting control of hills that are overlooking all of these Ukrainian positions on the river valley over here. And so, in terms of an offensive area where the Russians could exploit, this area just to the west of the Oskil River seems to be the most connected to the current front line, and it could also be the most lethal. And you look at the Ukrainian presence in the region, and just in terms of well-established units, it's almost non-existent. It's not to say that there are other units that are stationed over here, because there are UAV crews, there are these independent rifle battalions, but in terms of their strength, in terms of their size, it is simply not enough to deal with a large offensive force if that were to exist. And then you look at some of the other targets that are in the region. Further south, you have Veliki Borluk. This is a very important city that would have to be taken over by the Russians in this case. And it's one where you have, again, the connection of these various highways that then go through and reach the Russian border. And that's something that the Russian armored forces would then have to utilize as they would intend to advance further south. And again, in terms of a more long-term outlook, this area that I was talking about in the Vovchansk region in Veliki Borluk is located to the east of Kharkiv, and then would give the flank for the Russian forces to, in the very, very long term, position themselves to attack the city itself. But now, in terms of the actual troop compositions, since we're on that topic, here is a graphic I made. It's the northern group of forces. This is a new operational grouping for the Russian side, which is really composed of elements of the Leningrad military district. And so, just by looking at publicly available information, I do have information on some of the units that are involved in this grouping. And I just wanted to try to get an idea of whether the reports coming out, mainly from the Ukrainian side, regarding the size of the Russian forces over here are correct. Because you did have some Ukrainian military observers saying that there are roughly 50,000 Russian forces stationed along the Russian Ukrainian border as a whole, which includes, of course, the Bryansk, Kursk, and Belgorod regions. These reports indicated there are 31,000 located in Belgorod, 10,000 in Kursk, and then potentially over 8,000 in Bryansk, which again makes sense based on where we're seeing the most activity in Belgorod right now. And then you had, for instance, the interview with the deputy head of the Ukrainian military intelligence agency, saying that at the moment the Russian forces have something in the ballpark of 30,000 or 35,000 forces located in this northern grouping, in that the Russian forces are preparing to expand that amount to 50 to 70,000. And that would become a more significant force. But looking at what we have available, I have mapped out several units that are really not known. A lot of them, you might assume that I'm mixing them up with other units because of the numbers, but no, these are new units. These are territorial units, territorial motorized rifle regiments created by the Russians. I don't know if they're at full capacity. I don't know if they're really at the size of a regiment, but that's what they're being called. Then you have this other brigade. You have the 3rd Battalion of the 104th VDV Regiment, which was operating around Kherson, but apparently some of its elements have been moved further northwards. And then you have the 18th Motor Rifle Division. This is a very important element because this unit is currently not active on the front line, and it really hasn't been that active throughout the course of the war. Of course, had some involvement in the Kharkiv front earlier on, but this division, it was established or reestablished in 2020, and it consists of 3 motorized rifle regiments and one tank regiment. And so that force would give the Russians the actual reserves needed to conduct a more significant push than what we're seeing right now. And it's not been committed yet. So you really do have to keep an eye out for what the Russians end up doing with that division. Now, looking at the other forces in the region, if you counted, and I don't have all of them added in because some of them I just want to find logos for, but I can't find the actual symbology. Just looking at the ones we do have, we have 245th, we have this Spetsnaz unit, which defended against the Russian or the Ukrainian incursions across the border during the March elections. You have Ahmad Zapad, and so they are the National Guard, Chechen forces that are guarding in this region. I don't know how many of them are actually present. Could be in the hundreds or the low thousands. I'm not exactly sure. And then you have the 138th Motorized Rifle Brigade. And so in total, when you measure it, there are 4 territorial motor rifle regiments, 1 motor rifle regiment, and 1 brigade that I've counted on the actual border with Belgorod, besides the ones that I mentioned within the northern group of forces. And so when you combine all of them together based on that information, it appears the Russian forces have around 30,000 men over here. But that, of course, could be higher if the Russian forces are in the process of admitting in additional elements of the 6th, 11th, and 44th Combined Arms Armies into the northern group of forces, which is something that is probably happening because all 3 of those aforementioned combined arms armies, are parts of the Leningrad district. And so it would be logical based on their placement where they're currently located on the Luhansk Kharkiv fronts, and they will be admitted into the northern group of forces, at least certain elements of them. And that would then bolster the manpower of this grouping. And then at that point, it could reach into 50,000, like the Ukrainian intelligence chief was explaining in his interview a week ago. Looking at the Ukrainian defensive composition, it is mainly composed of these territorial defense brigades. You can see some of them over here marked further north. Going to Sumy Oblast, you have the 104th. And I'm not going to count all of these because it just is redundant at a certain point in time. But you sense the pattern of how there are rifle battalions, there are territorial units, you have battalions of territorial units, which is even smaller in size. Then you have these Russian volunteer units, Freedom of Russia Legion. And then when you add up all those various anti Putin Russian units that are operating within Ukraine, they are pretty small in size. Like we're talking about hundreds when you add them up all together. And so it does not make a massive change in terms of helping Ukraine defensively. And then you look at some of the other units over here, a lot of them just are not connected to a larger brigade structure or a larger command structure and are operating independently. And so a major issue, even in an area where you do have a pretty tight knit command structure, like in Donbass, even there are issues with communication between various units, especially between drone crews and infantry. So just imagine how much more compounded that could be in an area like the Kharkiv border, where it is much larger, where there are just these isolated villages that are not close to one another, where there are less roads near the line of contact, and where they're not used to heavy fighting over this long period of time. Just imagine what sort of issues there are currently arising between coordination of all these units. And so let's just continue going. Sibir Battalion, yeah, what is this? The RVC. You have this Ichkarian unit that is a part of the GUR, and then you have a bunch of other Ukrainian territorial units if you click on them. And when you add it all together, plus the drone groups, plus all the rifle battalions, it's somewhere in the ballpark of 12,000 Ukrainian forces. It could be a bit higher if I'm missing out on some smaller units, as I said before, maybe some National Guard units or police forces that are operating over here. But it is generally in that number. And then you look at the ratio between the Russian and Ukrainian side, it is perhaps 3-1, but it could be higher depending on what's going on with the northern group of forces. And so that would be enough, just based on the 3-1 principle, for being able to advance in a sector just to conduct successful offensive activities. And then you also look at the Russian firepower that is present in the area. But also keep in mind that the Russian forces may be gauging the Ukrainian defenses at this point and have not yet made a decision whether they want to exploit it to the extent where they want to actually advance several kilometers into the Ukrainian territory. Either they want to do that or perhaps they want to continue fixing Ukrainian reserves in this area, because I just explained to you guys how weak the Ukrainian grouping is at the moment. So they want to fix additional Ukrainian forces over here and then just take advantage of that fact and continue advancing on more critical parts of the front line around Donbass. That is certainly a possibility. And now, at the same time, as we're talking about Russian offensive actions, we also had a very busy day when it comes to airstrikes, whether it be specifically from FABs or perhaps from Lancets or just Russian artillery in general. And so, a lot of Ukrainian air defense systems were moved closer to the front line today in an effort to try to intercept various Russian planes that were flying above the skies, pretty far away from the line of contact, and that's why the Ukrainians need to move their air defense systems closer to reach them. They also did move in some artillery systems to target the Russian artillery that was pretty active today, and that did leave them exposed as they were leaving their hiding positions and getting into exposed areas that are closer to the Russian lines. And that's why we saw an increase in videos today showing the destruction of Ukrainian artillery and air defense systems. And so there's just a few examples that I'll show over here. Here we have a video of a Russian Lancet destroying the 155mm 2S-22 self-propelled howitzer in Borshova, located very close to the line of contact when you look at it now, only about 12 kilometers away. And so that was destroyed by the Lancets. I think there was 15 Lancet videos that were published today by the Russian side. And in terms of the more prominent ones, you had one where it was an Iskander M missile that hit, or a rocket that hit and destroyed an AN/MPQ 64 air defense radar and a Patriot air defense system. Now, the debate that is currently going on is whether those two were decoys, and that's something that I'm just wholly unqualified to speak about. I'm not good at identifying whether they're actually decoys or whether they're legitimate systems. In any case, here's the geolocation. You can see that again, the drone that was recording this video was recording it at a very high resolution, and again, pretty deep, not that deep compared to some other videos, but still deep into the front lines when you measure it. Looking at it, it's about, we could say, 38-40 kilometers away from the line of contact. And then in some additional drone footage that was published by the Russian side, you see that there were 3 emergency vehicles that moved into the same area where the strikes were conducted, and regardless of whether it's real or not, the strikes were actually very accurate in terms of where they were targeting. And then, of course, the blast radius does yield even more damage in that regard. And so that emergency crew that was sent in, it was either sent in because there were actually crew members over there and because there was legitimate damage caused, or because of the forest fire that was caused, regardless of whether it was real or fake. Additionally, today the Russians destroyed a modified Soviet Buk-1 air defense system, which was utilizing the newly provided AIM or RIM-7 missiles that were provided by the US in the latest presidential drawdown authority. And so they were actually, these Buk air defense systems, which are the Soviet iteration, they were retrofitted to actually be able to fire these American missiles. And so now that system is referred to as the Frankenstein system. And so 2 of those were actually destroyed today, and in one such case, the support truck for the Buk system was also destroyed, and that was likely due to either Lancets or, in the other case, using MLRS systems. And so that's all I have for today. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.